Okay. Are we on? Yeah. Okay. So I'm silencing my phone. Okay. So welcome everyone. Today is the 18th and it's a Sunday. This is our weekly Dharma talk. And hello to those who, some of you usually join us and aren't here today. So I just want to give a shout out to everyone. It feels kind of strange talking to a camera. Anyhow, so so some of you were here last week, and this is a continuation of talking about fear. Last week, the topic was fear and finding balance in the midst of it, which can be really challenging. And the story of the 2 arrows was shared last week. You're familiar with that story, right? Yeah. And it can also be applied to this reaction that we have when fear comes into the space. You can feel it in your body, your mind, and your heart. So there's this contraction to fear that creates a feeling of a separate self. And if you think about that moment of separation, that's the painful, that's where the suffering begins, right? The story begins, the suffering begins. We become like this solid self that is experiencing fear that, and the way we're relating to it is from a place of feeling victimized. So there's a story of a me in here and them out there, or a life out there. And I say that we don't have to go very far back in time to recall a moment where there was some kind of fear. It could it could have been a physical experience you had, a near car collision, tripping while walking, a medical issue, or maybe it was something on the emotional level, some unexpected news or a challenging situation. There's many moments where we experience this feeling of fear. The story of the two wolves was also shared, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, right? The good wolf.
The one that you feed them all?
Yeah, yeah, the one. Yeah. So the good wolf and the bad wolf, and which one wins depends on which one you feed. Um, so I was thinking about that, and I think often it's not that clear. You know, it's not. Um, Sometimes it's not that black and white. The one thing we do have in common is this mind that is very powerful and can think thoughts that are wonderful and freeing, mundane and boring, and catastrophic and anxiety building. We can have moments where all of that is there. So it's really important to have some kind of practice where we can see where we're resting our attention. Meditation allows us to see this, and it can lead towards freedom and empowerment versus victim mentality and everything that follows that kind of thinking. And it's challenging. So I like to add that at the end. So here's a poem. It's called A Parade by David Barnes. Like a parade of exotic animals, feelings come to my door. They only leave a trace if I take them in and feed them. Then it is up to me to follow with my shovel and broom and clean up after their passing. Why can't I just pet them and be done? Does that make sense? Yeah.
It, it's okay. I just, because this was something that just came to me, and it's like an epiphany, I guess you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I can't believe it took all these years. I think I finally got it with the self and the non-self. What I was probably doing wrong was thinking in absolutes.
Mm-hmm.
When I don't think Buddhism is telling you there isn't a self. What they're telling you is if you cling the things that cause you suffering.
Mm-hmm.
You wrap yourselves around those.
Yeah.
That's not the real you. And that is not the self.
Right.
It's when you're living day by day and you see the wonderful things at the moment. That's your true self. If you used to keep thinking, how could there not be a self? How could not? They don't really mean in absolute terms. And now it makes clearer that Einstein quote that you had, where we live in a delusion about that this is, he was referring to these thoughts, that thought stream.
Right.
And it just was a
huge epiphany.
Yeah, I mean, and after all these years, because I kept thinking the wrong way. I kept thinking like self is zero. And how could that be? But that's not, I don't think they really, the teaching really means that.
Mm-hmm.
It's living in the present moment and
right.
not being caught up with the storytelling.
Exactly. That last line is it exactly. That story making mind creates this sense of a solid self. Right. And when we identify with that, then that's where the suffering begins, right? Because we're believing whatever story we have in our mind, then and we're there's so many judgments and so much desires and all these things that are wrapped up into that story, that kind of clouds the reality of what's here. So going further, fear is a really strong trigger for the story-making mind. And it's also a strong trigger for that solid sense of, like I said, a self in here and the world out there. That's where we create a division, right? We disconnect from life in that moment where we have that story that I, in some way, am being targeted. And it can feel like I'm being victimized. But it's really my own stories that are creating that. So there could be, it's not negating that something valid is happening that could be tragic or painful, but then there's all of this added layering of what it means and, propelling it into the future and then creating catastrophes in the future, and your body's going along for the ride. Nothing's happened other than what really did happen. But then all that creation of stories then hooks your emotional energy and your mental energy and physical, and you're reacting to your stories rather than what's happening right here.
I'm sorry, I want to make sure I got it all out. It's also that our connection to everything. We separate ourselves as if, but we're not separate. We're part of. We look at everything else as connected, except us.
Yeah, yeah. I forget who it was who was talking about how we walk on the earth, and it's almost like we think we're separate from the earth, but we actually come from the earth, and we're part of nature, and we forget that.
Right, and we give value. Even like we look at a bird, or we have a dog as a pet, and we give them, in I guess you could call it inherent value. Mm-hmm. It's regardless of whether they own a big home or
right. Yeah.
But we don't do that to ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
So that's come to me, and it's like
I could see that.
I know. I'm like
enthusiasm and excitement.
Why did it take me so many years?
Yeah.
I think I kept looking the wrong way. I kept looking. It made no sense to me. Of course, we exist and we're a self.
Right.
And I kept trying to look at it. Where is there no self? But that's not really what they mean.
Yeah. So I want to stay on.
Okay, I just wanted to
target.
Share that.
Yeah, and that is important because that's all part of it. That's part of that is so much a part of when we get triggered by fear, and even the trying to understand that concept of it's not that there's no self, but that it's not self. Like the things we take to be us are not us. Material things are not us. And more than anything, it's the fear that creates that. We're trying to create some sense of stability and safety in what is a very naturally changing world. Nothing is permanent. And we know that on an intellectual level, but on a real emotional and spiritual level, it's harder. So with all of that in mind, I began to think about what's the opposite of fear. This is really important. It's the antidote to this fear-based thinking that creates and can keep us in a state of disease and distress. So the opposite of fear is ease. But how do we get there? I mean, it sounds good, right? And who wouldn't want to get there? And as I say this, what I believe is one of the stepping stones towards that sense of ease. I invite you to notice your reaction even to me saying that. And I say that because even as you listen to a Dharma talk, it's an experience, it's a opportunity to practice mindfulness, to watch where the mind goes with what's being said and because the mind then goes into evaluation and trying to comprehend it a lot of times on a conceptual level. And this practice is much more deeper than that. And this is part of the insight part of meditation, right? Where if we listen, taking in what is said with an open mind, we can begin to gain insights into the reality of what's happening in the moment versus our stories. We get kind of caught in that conceptual level and we lose our connection to being present, being embodied, being connected to the heart. So we walk around much more connected to our thoughts, our intellect, than we are to our body, to the sensations that are here, to the heart, and to the breath. And also, I wanted to say that this isn't about eliminating fear, because we need it. So it's not about creating another division, making fear wrong and ease right. It's not that. Fear, after all, sometimes the signals that it sends are ones that we really do need to listen to. There is wisdom in that. When we get caught up in fear-based thinking, we can create a future world that hasn't happened and doesn't exist outside of our mind, but our body and our heart is reacting to it as if it does. So the first step towards liberating the mind and the heart, or towards that ease, that sense of ease, is the ability to see clearly. However, even before we can get there, there's another step we need to take. And that is the ability to accept what's happening in the moment. So without that acceptance, there can't be the seeing, right? So acceptance is key in liberating our hearts and our minds. And what is it that we're accepting? It's the reality of how things are. It's to accept the resistance we have sometimes towards accepting the reality. It's complicated, right? Yeah. Because honestly, it is challenging to accept things as they are. It means that we have to be in touch with the aversion or the clinging that is happening when we're in resistance with life. The resistance is actually what feeds the fear. In some way, there's a message that whatever's happening shouldn't be happening. And that's what leads to the resistance. And though there's some validity to when we say things shouldn't be this way. Like if you look at that, where it's not about making that thought wrong, but it's seeing that sometimes we get stuck there, fighting against what's happening. And fighting life is as helpful or effective as trying to stop the waves in the ocean. Right? So we can't stop the waves, but we can learn how to surf them. And this is actually acceptance, right? When we learn to surf the waves, that's the acceptance. It's also that we're when we do that, we're reconnecting to life. We're now flowing with life instead of against it. And it's really important when I use the word acceptance, a lot of times um, when I've used it with clients or even here, a lot of times, sometimes we think of the word resignation, and acceptance is not resignation. It isn't just giving up and saying, well, this is just the way it is. There's nothing I can do. I just have to resign myself to this. Because that then feels kind of hopeless and, disempowering, right? It's actually the acceptance, so I can stop, that helps us to let go of the resistance, and then we're reconnecting with what can we do. A lot of times our energy gets stuck on how there's nothing we can do at all, and how terrible that feels, and the fear that comes up around that, and the stories, and so on and so forth, right? So what I'm going to read now comes from a Dharma chant. And this chant embodies acceptance. May I develop an attitude of complete acceptance and openness to all situations, emotions, and to all people. This is part of our mindfulness practice. What's included is the cultivation of, now bringing in another piece, the cultivation of loving kindness or compassion towards ourselves. And then in having that towards ourselves, we begin to open our hearts to life and to others. So mindfulness teaches us how to turn toward the full range of our human experience, not just the parts that we like, or the ones that only bring this sense of joy or peace. Because again, we're lopsided. We're only living one side of life. And life is a combination of all different experiences. So it's how can we stay present for all of it? In the Tibetan tradition, it is said that positive experiences are much more dangerous than negative ones. Because the minute you identify with being a successful person, all the other parts of you are immediately marginalized. It happens instantly. So it's like those parts that are marginalized don't exist. It's only the good parts, or the parts that make us feel safe. And I like the phrase he uses, that those parts go into hiding. Can you feel the contraction in that? The pain in that? The suffering in that? Yeah. And the resistance in that, right? This part shouldn't be here. This is from the Buddha. Well, I think it's not his direct words, but it's like a rephrasing of what he said. Why do I dwell always expecting fear and dread? What if I subdue that fear and dread, keeping the same posture that I am in when it comes upon me? While I walked, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither stood nor sat nor lay down until I had subdued that fear and dread. So, this is, I think, um, part of his story of enlightenment and how he sat under the Bodhi tree and sat through all of Mara's um, sending all these different negative energies to try and get him to doubt the practice or that liberation was actually attainable. But he sat through all of that. And I think that's the promise of this path. That coming into stillness is really important because then we can actually be with what's happening. And the mind has a tendency to go everywhere but stay present. Making sense? Yeah. So this is the practice of turning towards and staying present, open-hearted in the face of fear. And last week I talked about this posture of like meditating with open hands and imagining that you're holding whatever feelings are here, or whatever the experience is that you're sitting with. That it's neither this pushing away, you're not sitting like this, you're not clinging, you're not doing this either. And so we're just present with whatever it is that's arising. We're just giving it space and we're being with it, right? Because that's life. That's our lived life in this moment. And I love the way Gil Fronsel says to try to be simple with what's happening. Because we do the opposite. We make it really complicated. So that reminder is really important. If you're breathing, breathe. If you're walking, walk. If a feeling arises, let it be. We often get involved and try to manipulate experience. And again, this is where the suffering starts, the disconnection starts, the resistance starts. So this is also along the lines of learning to surf the waves. Fear often arises in response to a perceived threat. The threat of pain can trigger that fear response. Pain is distinct from the urge to eliminate it. I read that and it just really landed. Pain is distinct from the urge to eliminate it. It's separate, right? So we can work with the resistance by bringing our attention to the urge to in some way change, fix, or avoid it. And if we can stay with the urge, we can watch it arise, peak, and pass away. This is learning to surf the waves. This seeing the urge, pausing, being with, are all steps towards accepting experience just as it is without needing it to be different. So Christopher Germer wrote The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. And in his book, he talks about the stages of acceptance. And I like this because it shows a progression. You know, it's not just a word acceptance, but there's actually steps to it. It's not like a light switch that we can just get there by sitting on the cushion and closing our eyes and saying, okay, I accept everything that's here. That's not how it happens. So the stages of acceptance is the process of turning toward discomfort, and it occurs in stages. There's a progressive softening or non resistance. So you can come into the practice like this. And this is, if you think about it and you think about your experience meditating, it really is coming in like this. And as you meditate, you're beginning to soften, soften, open, open. And sometimes it's this kind of, back and forth, right? But it's the back and forth starts to get longer and longer, right? And so you learn to, there's many different ways to describe this, but um, Brene Brown, who I talked about last week, she talked a lot about shame. The shame is this, right? Staying closed. And she talked about that we need to be vulnerable. And so vulnerability is about leaning into discomfort. But that's how we grow. After an initial bout of aversion, which that's the resistance right there, we start the process with curiosity about the problem. And if all goes well, end with a full embrace of whatever is occurring in our lives. The process is usually slow and natural. So we're not trying to force it to happen, because then we get to this, right? And nothing can enter this. So it's really working on acceptance of what's here and softening around that. The process, so it makes no sense to advance to the next stage until you're entirely comfortable with where you are at the moment. So the stages are, the first one is aversion, and it shows up as resistance, avoidance, rumination. So when we ruminate, we're keeping it going, right? Yeah. The second stage is curiosity, turning toward discomfort with interest. Tolerance, safely enduring. The allowing, the letting feelings come and go. Not just feelings, sensations, thoughts, just letting them come and go. And friendship, embracing, seeing hidden value in what's happening, which is really hard. We usually don't see any value or very little. So going a little deeper into this. Our first initial reaction to uncomfortable feelings is always aversion. For example, we avert our gaze when we see something unpleasant. Right? Yeah. Aversion can also take the form of mental entanglement or rumination, trying to figure out how to remove the feeling. After a while, when aversion doesn't work, we enter stage 2, curiosity. And with curiosity, these are some of the questions we begin to ask, these inquiries. What is that feeling? When does it happen? What does it mean? When we know what we're dealing with, and if the pain doesn't go away, we may enter stage 3, which is tolerance. Tolerance means enduring emotional pain, but we're still resisting it and wishing it would go away. And as our resistance erodes, we enter the 4th stage, which is allowing, letting difficult feelings come and go on their own. And finally, as our lives adapt and deepen, we may find ourselves in the friendship stage, where we actually see hidden value in our predicament. These stages are by no means linear. You can go backwards, jump forward, and all in a few seconds. So it is that in order for us to let go of suffering, we have to see that it's happening. So that's, again, going back to the beginning of the talk, this is what I'm saying, that clear seeing of what's happening. And sometimes the only way we know it's happening is to feel the resistance that's in the body, right? The wanting to push it away. So this is taken from another book on inquiring deeply as a path towards acceptance and equanimity, where the author says that problems are also opportunities. In the words of anthropologist Margaret Mead, we are continually faced with great opportunities which are brilliantly disguised as unsolvable problems. It is certainly true that problems usually don't feel like opportunities. Problems feel painful. However, Mead's quote goes to the heart of inquiring deeply in the idea that there is a hidden surface in problems, a way to pay attention to them, which can free us from at least some of their struggle. Inquiry engages the effort to drop into a problem in a way that allows it to reveal itself. This reframes both attitude and view. Instead of directing our effort toward making the problem go away, we redirect our wholehearted attention to deepening our experience of the problem. The immediate gain in this approach is the possibility of greater acceptance of problems, a way to use our own intuition as an inner compass, which can help us navigate through the difficult terrain. There is an innate intelligence in, I would call it, challenging situations rather than problems, a wisdom encoded within them that we can better access when we bring appropriate awareness and discernment to them. So can you hear the wisdom in that? That usually when something arises that's challenging, we go into reactivity and there isn't a whole lot of wisdom, right? Yeah. And I like this line where he says, the great lesson is that life is a journey to be experienced, not a problem to be solved. I think that really summarizes it really well. Yeah, sure, yeah. And that, really it's when we're in fear-based thinking, we're in survival mode, and really we have the capacity to thrive, not just to survive, right? So I like Carl Rogers. And so this is from his book on I forgot what the name of the title of the book was, a person or something like that. So he says, whether we are speaking of a flower or an oak tree, of an earthworm or a beautiful bird, of an ape or a person, we will do well, I believe, to recognize that life is an active process, not a passive one. Whether the stimulus arises from within or without, whether the environment is favorable or unfavorable, the behaviors of an organism can be counted on to be in the direction of maintaining, enhancing, and reproducing itself. This is the very nature of the process we call life. This tendency is operative at all times. Indeed, only the presence or absence of this total directional process enables us to tell whether a given organism is alive or dead. The actualizing tendency can, of course, be thwarted or warped, but it cannot be destroyed without destroying the organism. I remember that in my boyhood, the bin in which we stored our winter supply of potatoes was in the basement, several feet below a small window. The conditions were unfavorable, but the potatoes would begin to sprout, pale white sprouts, so unlike the healthy green shoots they sent up when planted in the soil in the spring. But these sad, spiny sprouts would grow 2 or 3 feet in length as they reached toward the distant light of the window. The sprouts were, in their bizarre, futile growth, a sort of desperate expression of the directional tendency I have been describing. They would never become plants, never mature, never fulfill their real potential. But under the most adverse circumstances, they were striving to become. Life would not give up, even if it could not flourish. In dealing with clients whose lives have been terribly warped, in working with men and women on the back wards of state hospitals, I often think of those potato sprouts. So unfavorable have been the conditions in which these people have developed that their lives often seem abnormal, twisted, and scarcely human. Yet the directional tendency in them can be trusted. The clue to understanding their behavior is that they are striving in the only ways that they perceive as available to them to move toward growth, toward becoming. To healthy persons, the results may seem bizarre and futile, but they are life's desperate attempt to become itself. This potent constructive tendency is an underlying basis of what he used, which is the person-centered approach, right? So can you see the possibility in that? Yeah, the positive in that. Yeah. So I wanted to end with this poem. And I invite you to listen to it with eyes closed. I'm going to end the talk with the poem. It's called Will You? Will you go with the flow, giving the love that is in your heart so that others may be carried in its current? Will you honor a dream by taking a leap towards it, closing the distance with bold action and intent? Will you meet happiness where it lives, accepting only the present moment as real and knowing all you need for contentment resides here? Will you accept your own love and care for yourself in a way that reflects that? By nurturing your spirit from an endless source of respect. Will you let it slide, the imagined slight, the minor irritation, and trade it for the peace that comes from a mind at ease? Will you give back for no other reason than it is simply the person you choose to be? Will you walk in faith, knowing all that is lives inside you? And it is inconceivable to think you are ever alone. Will you dwell in possibility where imagination takes over and doors open before you even knock? Will you breathe from your belly, filling yourself with a deep inhale and releasing what no longer serves you? Will you allow today to unfold before you by letting each moment be what it is without having the need to change or control it? Will you? So, an invitation. So just opening it up for any comments or questions or sharing.
Did Carl Rogers, is that what?
Mm-hmm.
He's a psychologist, right?
He
One of
was,
the
yeah.
famous psychologists.
Yes.
The method he employed, I forgot what you personality something.
Person-centered approach.
Did it work?
If you did it right.
Yeah.
Was he able to document in a scientifically valid way that what he was doing with people was having?
So now we're going into conceptual.
Well, I got a number of issues with the whole discipline. That's why.
Okay.
But did it work? At least a little bit.
Yeah. Yes, it did. You can look him up.
Is wonderful. I'll look him up. I will.
Mm-hmm.
But that's from the 50s, right? 60s, 50s, 60s.
50s, yeah, 50s, 60s, probably, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's an approach of really seeing the humanness.
Yeah, I think he was on track with the philosophy of just whether or not he developed a process, a program, or treatment.
Well, there's a lot of information you can find online about him. So I would invite you to research him.
Yeah, if I was going to go to a therapist, I would not go to one who did not have a very thorough background in mindfulness like you.
Okay.
Because I don't.
So I don't want to turn this into therapy because this is
not
therapy.
It's from past things, including my wife, who I remarried.
Sure.
That I have a number of.
Sure.
Issues.
Yeah. So, but I really want to keep it on the topic that we're talking about, and so.
I understand.
Yeah.
Just that he's one of the famous ones. I wanted to get an idea what it accomplished.
Yeah.
Other than nice talking things.
So I think, to me, like part of this practice is really, excuse me, it's to see the wisdom that's in the words. It's to see beneath, even to see, at what the words are pointing at, not get stuck on the actual words, but what are they pointing at?
The direction that they're going.
Right. Well, I could point at the moon, but my finger is not the moon, right? So sometimes we get stuck on the words.
Right.
Like, this is the moon. This is not the moon, So the practice, even the teachings, are pointing at something that cannot be experienced on the intellectual level. We use words to try and guide, but the actual learning comes from, or the actual insight comes from sitting on the meditation cushion and being present to your moment-to-moment experience, right? And of course, when you listen to the Dharma, questions will arise, but that's why I started off by saying, even listening to a Dharma talk is a practice of mindfulness, to see, are the words landing, or are they hitting up against the conceptual mind that then tries to understand it on that level, and it kind of gets stuck there. And sometimes we have to do this, like it has to get stuck there over and over again before it finally permeates, right? So and there is this kind of back and forth that happens, so it's not kind of it lands and now I'm open and I understand everything, and I don't need to listen to Dharma talks anymore, and I don't even need to meditate because I know it all. And it isn't that. It's a continual. It's a journey from I say from the moment you start to breathe to the moment you take your last breath. How can I be present to this? Come back here. It's continually coming back here because we leave. And sometimes we leave more often than others, depending on what's happening. So it's not making ourselves wrong for that. It's just noticing when that's happening and what's going on, as I leave here. What am I sitting with? What is the mind doing? So it's that kind of open inquiry that leads to deeper insights.
It's kind of like it is a conscious effort, is it
Sure.
not?
Yes.
I mean, it's deliberate. If the person
Yeah.
it invites it in, lets it in.
Right. So there's this wise effort that's one of the steps on the path. And that wise effort meaning that we're not trying to force something to happen. Because sometimes in our meditation, we could do that. Like, we're judging whatever our meditation is. And that's trying to, package it and make it be what the mind thinks it should be so that it's successful. But that just keeps you in that suffering, right? Because there's not the acceptance of this is the way the meditation is right now. The mind is scattered, and how can I be with that acceptance and not making that wrong? Because then the moment I make it wrong, I'm layering the suffering and the contraction, and now there's a solid me that's sitting here on the cushion meditating that is wrong and needs to be different. So it's this kind of the open the symbolism of the open hands and just the acceptance of this is what's here right now.
It just reminded me of an experience I did when I was meditating. I was saying, "Go away, Ray. Go." The thing that was
Right.
bothering me.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it is this: how can we be present for whatever's here, even the resistance, the wanting to push it away? How can we be present for that?
Or being present to the fact that we can't be as present as we want to be.
Yes. The acceptance of wherever you are, right? Yeah. That's part of the practice. So, and another part of the practice is meditating. Very important part. So that's what we're going to do right now. And so even in setting up for meditation, to be really aware of as you sit, how you're sitting. Can you feel your feet on the ground if you're sitting on a chair? So find the posture where there is a feeling of presence, feeling the weight of the body. And as you sit, gently closing your eyes, taking a breath into the body and feeling that breath, the sensation of the breath as it enters, and the sensation as it leaves the body. And you might start by taking a few deep breaths, really feeling that breath come in and expand the chest, the belly, the lungs. On the exhale, softening where you can, shoulders, arms, hands, lower body, fingers and toes. Notice if there's any tension in the face and see if you can soften the space between the eyebrows, the jaw, the lips. Allow the weight of the body to settle down towards the earth. Letting go a little bit more on each out-breath. So taking time to settle in the here and now. And now allowing the breath to settle and find its own natural rhythm. letting the breath breathe itself. Notice how the body moves in response to the breath. The chest expanding, relaxing, the belly rising and falling. Just a gentle awareness. Letting go the best you can of your thoughts and concerns from the day in order to settle into the experience of breathing. As if breathing is your home base. And notice where you feel the breath most strongly. Perhaps the movement of the belly rising and falling, or the chest rising and falling, the rib cage expanding and contracting. Or perhaps feeling the air coming in and out of the nostrils. Feel the shifts and changes. The in-breath and the out-breath. When you notice that you're drifting off in thought, just notice that. See if you can be simple with that. Notice that's happened. Be mindful. And then, without commentary or judgment, begin again with your breathing. Begin again being aware. Breathing in and breathing out. And then, with a sense of curiosity and acceptance, beginning to investigate. As you're sitting here, what's your overall mood or state? What's the overall general state of being? There are many things you might notice like that. Are you tired or alert? Do you feel contracted or expanded? Calm or agitated? Fuzzy or clear? Anxious or relaxed? Interested or bored? Patient or impatient? And being aware of this overall state, how does it affect you? How does it affect how you see what's going on and how you're relating to it? How are you influenced by the state you're in? And as you're mindful of all this identity, shift what you identify yourself with from your mood or your attitude to the mindfulness, the awareness that knows and recognizes the state you're in. And then shifting gears a little bit with whatever you're noticing now, with whatever is happening now. What is your attitude towards that? How are you relating? What is your relationship to what is happening with meditation for you, or the situation you're in now, the thoughts you have, the feelings you have? What's the relationship or the attitude? Are you for it or against it? Liking it or not liking it? Enjoying it or resisting? Is there a wanting or not wanting? What's your attitude towards what's happening? It might even be your attitude towards all these questions. Can you shift your identity? Shift yourself from kind of being the attitude, believing the attitude, to being mindful of it. Can you step out away from it and watch it? Cultivating the ability to see clearly what's happening and changing the way we relate to experience actually helps us to befriend our inner life, to connect to life in a deeper way. And for the last part of this meditation, shifting back to the breath. And see if you can stay with the breath. May this practice be for the benefit of us and for benefit of all beings everywhere. Namaste.